Eat human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
ピーク人間
Piczątka niewiód.
Dr. Bill Schindler is the director of the Eastern Shore Food Lab at Washington College, where he is also an associate professor of archaeology and anthropology. 2 years ago, he co-hosted the National Geographic show The Great Human Race. He spent the last year abroad continuing his hands-on research and professional development by immersing himself and his family with indigenous and traditional groups around the world to learn about their food and diets. As an experimental archaeologist and primitive technologist, his specialties are in recreating technologies of the past to better interpret our ancestral diets. His current focus is learning how to translate the outcomes of that research into something meaningful for modern-day diet and health, and is working to fuse lessons from our ancestral dietary past with modern culinary arts to create a food system that is relevant, accessible, and meaningful to modern Western life. We got into so many interesting things like the development of humans and how it tracked with food technology, drinking blood and milk with pastoral tribes in Africa, eating brains, ancient food preparation and hunting, my favorite topic, nutrient density, and so much more. It was so enlightening talking to him. I'll stop now so you can have a listen. Oh wait, I have to mention the Food Lies film. Pre-order on Indiegogo to support its creation and support this podcast. Thanks. Dr. Bill Schindler, it's so great to have you on the podcast. We had such a good phone call last week, so I'm excited to talk now and record it this time.
Yeah, we sure did. It's my pleasure, and I'm glad we're going to have a chance to continue the conversations we started last week.
Yeah, and you do so many things, so I want to hear all about them. I know you're archaeologist and an anthropologist and more. I didn't actually really know about your TV show. I kind of skipped that part, but you're on a Nat Geo show, which is really cool. I watched an episode last night, and so yeah, we're going to get to a lot of things. How humans evolved and what they ate and how they lived. But let's start with your story.
Sure. It's a long story, but I think all those different parts of my life, the ones that have been a part of my life for many years, and even the newer ones, all really come together to allow me to look at human diet and health, I think, in a really unique way. And I hope over this conversation I can relay to you, my unique perspective on this. So I'm a professor at Washington College. It's a small liberal arts college on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. It's a wonderful place to teach and to work and really to get things done. They're very supportive. So I'm an associate professor in the anthropology department. I have been the chair of the department for some time, but I recently stepped down from that to take on a brand new role as a director of the Eastern Shore Food Lab here at Washington College. It's a new endeavor. I've been working on it for many years, and we're finally set to launch next month.
That's awesome.
So I think we're going to get to talk about that quite a bit over this conversation. But I think, my past and the work that I've done up until this point might be really relevant for you to understand my perspective on all of this. So I guess it really starts with when I was a kid, I always been interested in hunting and gathering and trapping and foraging and being out in the woods as much as possible. My father had me out on a regular basis, and I thank him for that. And it really gave me that really unique link and connection with our environment, our outside world. I grew up in Monmouth County, New Jersey, which is only a few miles from the beach. And right on the train line to New York City. So for him to get me out to the places he thought I needed to be, it often meant a huge time investment for him. We're driving up to Delaware Water Gap in northern New Jersey into Pennsylvania in a place called Montrose, where I learned to hunt from him and also from his best friend. And during that time, I knew I felt a really close connection to everything that I was doing, but I really didn't understand what exactly it was that was so special. I certainly knew I valued the time with my father. I valued learning. I valued being out in the woods and the smell and the sights and just that whole thing. But I never really enjoyed in any form killing. But I always felt like it was very important for me to be a part of the process in some way. And it was strange because I understood many of the debates and the people that were against killing and against those sorts of things. Certainly, in many ways, they were. Their voices were somewhat endangering this thing that I loved. But at the same time, I understood many parts of what they were saying. And I couldn't quite put my finger and come to terms with everything that I was feeling and thinking ever since I started hunting and all this from an early age. Later on, I realized what it meant. But at the time, I didn't know. And the other thing that I thought that's very important to my past and my childhood is my mother had me in the kitchen on a regular basis. We were cooking up a storm. My mother, my grandmothers, I had an Italian grandmother that I learned a ton from as well. And this whole time, what was really unique, I think, about my perspective as a kid was that these were separate things. Like, okay, my father took me out to hunt, and that was one thing. And then my mother had me in the kitchen. It was something completely different. And it took me a long time to realize that these two passions in my life, connecting with our environment, and later on, because I love to do everything that I can do entirely from scratch. And I started building my own bows and making my own arrowheads, which is in many ways why I became an archaeologist, to learn how to do those things better. I realized that those things were uniquely and intricately connected to the kitchen and to feeding myself. And obviously, from this perspective in hindsight, that makes complete sense. But for me as a kid, that link was never really made. So, I'm cooking up a storm. I'm outside on a regular basis. And then I started to become a wrestler, an athlete in high school and then later on in college. And I eventually was a Division I wrestler at Ohio State. Later on, for a series of reasons, I was a Division III wrestler at the College of New Jersey. And certainly diet and wrestling are intricately linked. And then not necessarily all in good ways, but I was very cognizant of diet throughout this entire time, maybe even too much so. My parents hired nutritionists for me. Coaches certainly had, whoever I was wrestling for at the time had their own opinions, where I was cutting massive amounts of weight in college. I was cutting about 22 pounds every week to make weight. And so diet was always on my mind. The kitchen was always on my mind. That's how I always escaped, was cooking. And I was passionate about learning more about connecting with the outside world. And as I learned how to hunt better, I also taught myself, and then thankfully was mentored by some of the best primitive technologists in the world, and learned how to make stone tools and make bows and make pottery and do all brain tan deer skins, all of those things that we now associate with the primitive technology world. And I was learning how to hunt and connect in really important ways. And eventually, this led me to archaeology, because once I started to kind of gain this skill set that allowed me to understand how things could have been done in the past, I wanted to know how they were done. How did people in my part of the world hunt deer with stone points 2,000 years ago? What did those stone points look like? I didn't want to hunt a deer with a stone point. I wanted to hunt a deer in New Jersey with that stone point. I wanted to go somewhere else and do something completely different. And I became an archaeologist just for that reason. And what I found over time was that archaeology is a fantastic discipline. I absolutely love it. I really appreciate everyone who can sit and excavate for extensive periods of time in holes very, very slowly for months and sometimes years on end with the flies and the poison ivy and the dirt and the sweat. But I really wanted to connect. That wasn't the kind of archaeology that I was really passionate about. I was passionate about learning about the past, but making it relevant to today, at least for myself, later on for my students, but at the time for myself. And I found ways to fuse my skill set with primitive technology with my understanding of archaeology. And there is an entire field that I was at the time starting to learn about, that has been around for a while, called experimental archaeology. And that is how I would define myself right now in the archaeological community, as an experimental archaeologist. So what we do is, you can imagine excavating really old archaeological sites, we pull all bits and pieces and fragments of artifacts from the past out of the ground. Some of these things we know exactly what they are, or think we do. And some of these things we have absolutely no idea how they were used. And it's a continuum and everywhere on that line as well. So what experimental archaeologists do is use their primitive technology skills or understanding of the archaeological record and replicate these tools and technologies to better understand how they were made, how they were used, how they functioned, how efficient they were, and eventually how they were finally discarded and became part of the archaeological record. And there's incredible people around the world that are experimental archaeologists. And there's several organizations around the world that are really leading the charge in making experimental archaeology accessible to other archaeologists and publishing and keeping and creating standards. And one of them is XARC. It's based out of the Netherlands, and I'm currently the chair of that organization. And another is REARC, which is based out of the U.S. So this entire time, I'm learning about the past. I'm learning about technologies. I'm honing skills, learning from masters literally around the world. And at the same time, I'm very concerned with my own diet, cooking up a storm. But still, that link necessarily hasn't been made until I had kids. And when I started having kids, several things happened. The first thing was that my wife came to me, and I think I might have been in the garage that night banging on rocks or making some sort of a stone tool. And she said, listen, I need you in the house. I said, yeah, I got this, but this is important. She said, no, I need you actually in the house. Like, this is all important. I completely get it. But can you take this passion and this knowledge and do something that actually helps the family? I don't think she said it that crass, but it was something like this. Can you bring it into the house? I don't mean tonight. I mean like forever. And I thought about it. And she's absolutely right. How can I do this? What am I really worried about right now with this brand new baby? What can I do that can help our family in some way? And it was like a light bulb moment. I realized that almost every single primitive or prehistoric or ancestral technology that I've been spending decades learning about, studying, is related to food. Almost every single one of them has something to do with getting food, processing food, storing food, redistributing food. Almost every single prehistoric technology has something to do with that. So that's where I shifted my focus. I said, wow, all of these things that I've been learning my entire life really do come together. Food, stone tools, all of it, archaeology. So I brought it into the house, and I used it really to improve my health, my wife's health, our family's health, and eventually brought it into the classroom and all of my research. And my wife bringing me into the house was certainly significant in that regard. But there was a moment with a student that really transformed the way, it really defined and transformed the way that I think about food and diet and health and the relationship between ancestral diets in the past and modern issues with human diet and health today. And it happened one day. I was teaching a lot of different classes. I teach cultural anthropology classes. I teach prehistoric archaeology classes, experimental archaeology classes, and classes that are just solely focused on food. And I had a student that was in two of my classes that semester. One of the classes this student was in was focused on prehistory in some form. I don't remember what the class was. And the other class was focused on food, and mostly food in more of a modern sense, sort of a cultural anthropology look at food and, modern food ways. So I talk about food processing quite a bit in my teaching. And I said something about food processing in one of these classes, and the student raised their hand and says, Professor Schindler, I have a question. You say food processing a lot, but when you were talking about it the other day in the prehistory class, you got this smile on your face. You were visibly excited to talk about food processing. She says, right now, we're talking about food processing today, and you're visibly angry. What's the story? Where do you draw that line? And I looked at her, and I had literally a deer in the headlights, no response whatsoever. I knew there was a difference. I knew that I loved talking about and embracing food processing in the past, and I knew that I am completely against almost every form of modern food processing that we see today. But I said what you're supposed to say in these situations. I'll get back to you. I don't know, but I'll find out and get back to you. And I literally did soul searching for at least a week. I thought about it in the shower. I couldn't sleep at night. I mean, it was something that I realized that I had to pin down if I was going to move forward in any of my research or teaching. So I figured it out. When you look at these technologies in the past, the food processing technologies that the archaeological record suggests that we were engaged in for literally millions of years, the focus was on nutrient density. These technologies increased the density of nutrients in food and made those nutrients more available to our bodies. Now, certainly it's much more complicated, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but for me, this was a light bulb moment. But the food processing technologies now are focused on things like money and shipping and storage and shelf life, usually at the expense of the nutrients. So this was great. I finally had something defined, and from there I could move forward.
It's almost always lessening the nutrient density. It's a dilution, all of our modern processing. But I guess you have to differentiate which type of processing, which we can get into, because there's processing like just processing meat, just the act of cutting it up is not, I wouldn't consider modern processing, but all the processed foods that end up in box or bag is what we're referring to in the modern sense. And that almost always, 99.9% of the time, decreases the nutrient density.
Absolutely. So I don't mean all the things we do with food today are at the expense of nutrients. The ones almost, and it's also on the other side of the coin. It's also very important, and I truly believe this, that how do I say this the right way? I do believe that almost all food processing technologies in the past increased the density of nutrients in food and or increase the bioavailability of those nutrients. I firmly believe that. I also firmly believe that most of the food processing technologies that are part of the modern food processing world that have been created, in modern and historic times are at the expense. But the ones that we still do today that have ancient and historic roots, there's wonderful things happening to our food today, but the ones that are wonderful really have roots in traditional or ancestral foodways. There are some things, though, however, like, and I'm sure we'll talk about grains quite a bit later on, but I don't think that all of the new things are necessarily bad. I don't like to cut things off at 12,000 years ago and say everything before that's good, everything after it's bad. The way we slowly ferment long sourdough breads, for example, is another form of increasing the density and the availability of nutrients in grains.
Yeah, I don't have I think we figured out a lot of things recently, and we just need to pick and choose which ones are good and bad. I mean, you could even talk about dairy, or some people are lactose intolerant, but yeah, I think if you can handle dairy, then and it works for you, then yeah, it's great. We don't have to do everything like our ancestors.
Absolutely. And, dairy is a great example. And I'm happy, maybe this is a good place to talk about dairy or not, but let me start. You can stop me and we can move on. Well, actually, let me front load this example with something very, very quickly. When I took this stance on looking at technologies that really were important for increasing the density and availability of nutrients, I started to look more closely at what exactly, what exactly are these technologies, and what are the tools and parts of the archaeological record that we can observe and see these things, and what does it all mean? And when we do that, we look back to a certain point in time when everything changed. And that point in time right now, it may change when we find new things, and it's actually a fairly new find that of the date that I'm going to tell you. But when we look back in time, practically 3.5 million years ago, to be more exact, it's somewhere between 3.3 and 3.4 million years ago, is the moment that everything changed. At that moment, one of our ancestors struck one rock against another and created the first stone tool, created a first sharp edge. And this was significant, because it's for the first time ever, or at least this is the evidence for the first time ever, that we transformed our relationship with the outside world. We no longer needed to rely on our own biology, our own physical makeup to interact with the outside world. One thing I say over and over again is that I believe humans are one of the weakest species on the planet. Our nails are almost useless. Our teeth are almost useless. We can't see very far. We're not very fast. We can't jump very high. We certainly can't fly. And, if we're relying on those physical limitations to get our food, we're actually severely limited. So prior to 3.5 million years ago, our diets consisted almost entirely of plants, fruits, and vegetables. Maybe a little bit of insects thrown in there, but that's it, because that's the only thing we could get. And our bodies were quite small. And our brains were quite small. And females were quite a bit smaller than males for a couple of nutritional reasons, mostly we think to do with reproduction. So at 3.5 million years ago, when we strike our first stone tool, we overcome these physical limitations. And we now can not only get food in a different way, in an enhanced way, but we can process that food before it goes into our bodies. Because if we are, and I truly believe this, one of the weakest species on the planet, our digestive tracts are even more inefficient on that sort of a scale. We have one of the least inefficient digestive tracts of any animal. So if we can do things, if we can enhance our ability to get food through technologies and tools, and then use technologies and tools to increase the nutrient density and availability of nutrients before those foods even go into our bodies, we can, again, overcome all these limitations. And the stone tool is the first one. And what we see at that time is the first evidence for butchering on the planet. And we have bones from Ethiopia that have distinct butchering marks on them. They from the date to 3.4 million years ago, and perhaps even more importantly, those bones also show impact fractures, which means not only were they slicing the meat off the bones, but they were cracking these bones open to get at the nutrient-rich marrow on the inside. So, what we've done over time is enhance and overcome our physical limitations through technologies and increase the density and availability of nutrients in our food. And beginning 3.5 million years ago, and I know it sounds simple, but even just a stone flake that takes less than 30 seconds to produce can make all the difference. And over time, we invent other sorts of technologies like fire, which was monumental 2 million years ago, and also hunting technologies at 2 million years ago. Because the story about our relationship with animals usually stops at a brief conversation that says, yep, beginning whatever date you want to use, we use now the date at almost 3.5 million years ago. But at 3.5 million years ago, we started eating meat. And then we move on to the next topic. And it's much more complicated and powerful than that. We started eating meat at 3.5 million years ago. We started eating meat because we weren't hunting yet, and what we were doing was scavenging. We were taking the stuff left over from what other predators or carnivores left behind after they made a kill. So meat is much more nutrient dense than vegetables and fruit. However, not much changes for us anatomically with this influx of protein into our diets 3.5 million years ago. The time period where we see the most significant biological change in our evolutionary past is 2 million years ago. And the two things that happened 2 million years ago is one, many people believe, and I'm one of them, that we are now controlling fire and can cook. And the second thing is that we're hunting. The difference between hunting and scavenging is huge. And we have first access to the animals that we kill. So all the good parts are eaten by the lions and the jaguars and everything else that did all the killing, we have access to. We go in and we can eat the organs, we can eat the blood, we can eat the fat, we can eat the brains, we can crack open and eat them. We get all of those things, and quite possibly sometimes we might even be leaving the meat behind for other animals to get in our path. So that's huge. We see a huge increase in body size, a huge increase in brain size, and a reduction of sexual dimorphism, or reduction of the difference between males and females at that time period. That's huge. So later on, we invent things like fermentation, and this continues certainly for some time. But the cool thing is, and now not necessarily intentionally, but what we do is we mimic in many ways what other animals do naturally, what their biology allows them to do, what their physical makeup allows them to do. We can't fly up into trees and get honey from bees, but we can create ladders and we can create mechanisms to get up. We can't hunt very easily without any assistance, but we create bows and arrows and atlatls and those sorts of things. So that's great. It helps us get food. We can't dig very easily in tough ground with our fingers and our nails, but we can create digging sticks that allow us to do that. And as far as food processing is concerned, we also mimic things that other animals do as well. So one example is, a cow. You put a cow out on pasture, eating grass like it's designed to do, and a cow can support its huge body by eating nothing but grass because it has teeth designed to do it, an upper palate designed to help break down the grass and the tough cell walls. Then they swallow it. It goes into the first chamber of a massive stomach called a rumen, and in there it's a fermentation chamber that ferments, and then they spit it up and chew it again, and it goes back and it ferments a little longer, and back and forth and back and forth. And then finally, it leaves and goes through the stomach and enters into a digestive tract that in many ways, not all, it's very similar to ours. Now, if we were out on that same field eating that same grass with a much smaller body, we would starve to death because our digestive tract does not allow us to break down the cell walls and the cellulose the same way that theirs does. But we don't have a fermentation chamber, but we have crocks. We have mason jars. We can ferment these things outside of our bodies and then stick them into our mouths and get incredible nutrition, increased nutrition by doing so. So in the form of dairy, and we can go on and talk about numerous examples in that regard where we're mimicking other animals. But dairy is a great one because dairy is very controversial in some of the world where people are looking to the past on how to eat. We are mammals as humans, and because of this, we have mammary glands, or women have mammary glands, and we feed our young with breast milk. What is different about humans is that for a while now, at least 8,000 years, probably a little bit longer, we have been drinking milk into adulthood from other animals. And that's one of these things where people will put that marker in that line in the sand and say, well, this is more recently than 12 or 15,000 years ago, so we shouldn't be doing it. And I don't believe that. I think we should step back and say, whoa, let's evaluate it the same way as we evaluate meat. Are we designed to eat meat? Absolutely not.
That sounds shocking coming from you, but yeah, keep going.
No, we're not. We are not designed to eat meat whatsoever, but we are designed. In fact, we require the nutrients that meat can provide us. And let me justify that or explain that. To make an argument or have a conversation about whether we should or shouldn't be eating based solely on our biology is absolutely ridiculous. because we haven't been getting our food or processing our food solely based on our biological makeup for 3.5 million years, right? So the fact that we don't have canines to help shred take down and shred the flesh off of an animal in the African savannah is silly. Of course we don't, because we can create a stone tool that can do it even more efficiently in 30 seconds. The fact that our gut length or gut acid or stomach acid is different than a carnivore, absolutely it is, because we do things to the meat. We cook it, we carve it up, we slice it, we dice it. It is difficult for humans to properly digest large amount of red meat. Absolutely. But think about if you go to a high dollar restaurant, what kinds, even if you eat that meat raw, if you eat really good high quality beef raw, how is it served to you? It's either carpaccio and it's sliced super thin, or it's tartare and it's chopped up. It's processed for us before we put it into our mouths. So the fact that we can't efficiently take down an animal, rip it to shreds, suck it into our bodies, and completely digest it based solely on our anatomy is absolutely true. But it doesn't matter, because what we've done is we have created technologies that allowed us to access meat and other parts of the animals, put those foods render them into the right states for our bodies to properly get nutrition from them. And most importantly, our bodies changed in response. So as we continued to change our diets, our bodies changed in response. 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens first appeared on this planet. It's not the diet that produced them, but that diet supported them. We wouldn't have been able to survive 300,000 years ago if we hadn't created these literally artificial diets through our own technologies that would have allowed us to support these huge bodies and really nutrient-needy brains. So for us to have a conversation about eating meat, should we be eating meat? Absolutely. Should we be eating animals? That's even more so. But the reason I say that is because our bodies are based on needing the nutrition that is provided through those sources. The justification isn't because, or the refuting or justifying it isn't because of what we biologically have that allows us to digest those foods, because we don't need them. We don't do that. We do it before it even goes into our mouths. But we have brains that require high quality animal fats in order to function properly, especially when our kids are very young. That's the argument. The argument is, what do we need nutritionally? And we look to the past for that. And then the next piece of it is, okay, how do I get that food and process that food in the best state possible so that my body can make the most efficient use of those foods? And that's the story of our dietary past over time and the technologies that we created over 3.5 million years that allowed us to process food outside of our bodies before it even went in. So,
well, yeah, that's why we're Homo habilis. That's how we became human, is we was using tools. That's part of our story, right?
Exactly. And so this is how I have a discussion about this with students. Let's use the term domestication for a minute. How do we define domestication? Well, a fairly general or generic way of defining domestication is you take a species and you put it in a cultural environment, an environment that we've created. So if it's plants, maybe we're watering it or giving it fertilizer or feeding it or protecting it from something else or making sure that it has access to sunlight. And if it's in the form of animals, it's maybe we're caring for it or protecting it or feeding it a certain kind of a diet, those sorts of things. And over time, in these culturally created environments, those species change biologically. They change genetically. Eventually, they no longer resemble their wild versions and in some cases can't survive outside of this culturally created environment. So we have this discussion. Then I say, what's the first domesticated species? Well, in the form of plants, many people think now it might be maize, right, at 15,000 years ago. In the world of animals, people are now pointing to dogs. I mean, there's some evidence that suggests that dogs were first domesticated out on the Central Asian steppe 20-something thousand years ago, maybe even older. But the answer to that question is humans. Mm-hmm. We began to domesticate ourselves 3.5 million years ago when we created our first stone tool. At that moment, we began to interact with our environment in a completely different way. And we began to get more and better food from our environment. And that just continued over time. And as we created new technologies, as we use those technologies in very unique and powerful ways, we got better and better and better food. We increased the nutrient density over time. We increased the availability of nutrients over time. We processed food outside of our bodies, and our bodies responded genetically in turn. and we got bigger and our brains got bigger and all sorts of things happened. In fact, it was what we did was so powerful that not only did we overcome our biological limitations, but the very things that we had really in and on our bodies that allowed us to get and process food were getting smaller and reducing. So our teeth, the first opportunity we have inside of our bodies to physically and mechanically break down food are getting smaller. I mean, our bodies are increasing in size over time, but our teeth are getting smaller.
Wow.
Our jaw muscles, the ratio of the jaw muscles to body size is getting smaller. It's insane to believe that the very things that we have that allow us to break down food are going away at the very time when our nutritional needs are increasing, and in some cases increasing exponentially. So we now have created bodies that require us to live in a cultural environment. We watch these survival TV shows. I was a part of one of them. But I mean, if we really think about it, we call these shows survival shows because we have this romantic image of humans going out into the woods with nothing and trying to live and trying to survive. And there's shows like Naked and Afraid, which the premise of, I actually, in many ways, in this line of thinking, I actually like. Not the fact that you've taken a man and a woman and they're naked in the woods. And I know they're doing that for ratings.
Or gimmick.
But the fact that you've stripped people down to nothing and said, survive. What's the first thing that they do? They have to make something in order for them to interact with the outside world. We have created a species that is so domesticated that if you stripped us, I don't care where you live in the world. I don't care how lush and how beautiful and how much food there is available around you in a natural way. If you stripped us of our technologies, we would starve. We would die. And we certainly, and if those statements are a little bit too strong, and maybe they are, we at least would never reach our full potential.
Yeah.
We need to use these technologies. So that's the story. So the idea that we shouldn't eat meat because we don't have large canines or because our digestive tract is a certain length or is in our stomach, those are silly arguments to me.
Yeah, that's insane. And there's so many things we need to go back to. But I love your line about our food processing technology tracked with our health and our brain size and all that stuff is so interesting to me.
Absolutely. And remember, technological developments, massive ones, were happening at a fairly, in some cases, especially in the beginning, slow pace in the past. So we have huge gaps in time. But in general, this is how I view our dietary past. Prior to 3.5 million years ago, we are frugivores and herbivores and maybe insectivores. And the only possible new thing that we think might have been introduced into our diets somewhere between 3 to 5 million years ago was the introduction of what we call underground storage organs, roots, corms, tubers, these sorts of things that are, high energy, high calorie, but maybe don't offer a whole lot beyond that. But the fact that you can have this huge influx of carbohydrates and calories at the time was something that was good. So we might have had that introduction very early on. We're not confident in that, but I actually believe that we did. Mm-hmm. At about 3.5, and not much is changing then. We're all fairly small, and our brains were certainly much, much, much smaller. And then about 3.5 million years ago, we have the first evidence for accessing meat from scavenged animals. And there's a little bit of a jump in body size, a little bit of an increase in brain size, but nothing hugely significant. But at 2 million years ago, when we have evidence for hunting, it's interpreted evidence, but I strongly believe this, that we began to control and use fire at around 2 million years ago. There is a huge jump in body size and brain size and a reduction in that, what I said earlier, that sexual dimorphism. And then over time, these things just continue to evolve. And we're at some point, we're inventing things like fermentation and we're learning how to detoxify certain plants from our environment, which is hugely important for us because, we tend to have this view of vegetables through the lens of going to a grocery store. We go into a grocery store, and if you ever said the word toxic and produce at the same sentence, people would be very, very angry and scared.
Yeah.
But the reality is almost all of our staple foods around the world that eventually became domesticated had toxic wild ancestors. And, potato is an amazing example. All wild potatoes are toxic and some are highly toxic. And even there's some suggestions now that even domesticated potatoes, the earliest domesticated potatoes were also had different levels of toxins in them. And even the regular run-of-the-mill potatoes you would get at the grocery store today, some people suggest have low levels of toxins in them that require cooking or some other form of food processing to detoxify. So that's why they say you should never eat a raw potato. But in the past, there were all sorts of technologies and traditions built around detoxifying potatoes. And one of them is actually using a geophagy, or the intentional consumption of earth, to help detoxify the potatoes. So there are stories about people sitting around huge pots of boiling mud or clay, and the potato would go into, you'd stick it in there on the way to your mouth, kind of like we would dip something into mayonnaise. And then you would eat this clay and the potato at the same time. And the idea is that the toxins would bind with something in the clays and pass through your bodies while you benefited from the nutrition of the potato. All sorts of things like this around the world. Manioc is another great example. So the story of our relationship with plants is not just ones of us finding these really safe plants to eat and consume. It's one of us figuring out how to detoxify all these plants that are in our natural environment. And without even moving, we're increasing our diet breadth. We're increasing our availability of nutrients in our local area by changing our ability or improving our ability to detoxify these plants. And many detoxification methods include things like drying or cooking or fermentation or geophagy. There's a whole host of these sorts of things. So, these are the kinds of technologies you can imagine are happening over the past 2 million years at some point. And we're just getting better and better and better at doing these things. We're getting better at hunting. We're getting better at preserving meat. We're getting better at all of these things. And then we get to obviously a point where it all changes, certainly on its head. Those technologies, the development of these technologies is the story of our dietary past. And what we can watch is at the same time our ancestors biologically and genetically changing in response to these diets. We appear as modern-day Homo sapiens at 300,000 years ago. We, for all intents and purposes, are not that much different than we were 300,000 years ago, at least on a biological level. Certainly things have changed and we've continued to evolve. But the way that our digestive tract works, the way that we take in food and biologically and take care of it and absorb the nutrients is essentially the same. And certainly our nutritional requirements are the same. Now, there's differences in how much are we moving and how much are we exercising. Certainly has an impact on our nutritional requirements. But to just run our bodies, which are very similar in size as they were 300,000 years ago, and to fuel our brains, which are in fact almost identical in size as they were 300,000 years ago. If anything, they're slightly smaller. But to do those things, our nutritional requirements haven't changed. So in my mind, we need to go back to that moment 300,000 years ago. And I don't know exactly what the diet was. Nobody does. But we go back there for inspiration and knowledge to understand what diet was there when we first appeared. And then that's where we need to start. And when we understand what that, or you have a little bit of a comprehension of that, that isn't the answer. That's the beginning point. And then we can go back and say, okay, for 3 million years, 3.5 million years, we have been developing technologies that increase nutrient density, increase the availability of nutrients, and even increase the variability of our diets. Let's use that. And we continue from that point forward. Let's use our modern technologies to reach those goals and do that even better instead of how we're doing it today.
Yeah, whatever you think about the paleo diet, and I don't believe in just we have to eat the paleo diet because, like you said, things have changed and we can utilize new technologies and information and do better than what we think the paleo diet was, or it doesn't even matter. I don't even care what it was, right? Yeah, no one knows exactly what it was. But the inarguable point is that 300,000 years ago, we were developed in a certain way, and these are our nutritional requirements. This is when they were established, and you can't argue with that.
Absolutely. And you also can't argue with the role that technology played in our diets as they changed. And if you think and I do, I truly believe that we accomplished the impossible. We created these bodies and these brains despite the biological limitations that we have as humans in getting food and digesting food.
Yeah.
I mean, it was almost impossible that we did it, but we did. I mean, we're here, we're living proof of this. But what's even more incredible, really, is that we now have used modern science to produce something that's even more impossible: obesity and malnutrition in the same individual. It's insane. We are producing food that is so nutrient-free. I mean, that's how we're using modern food processing technology to create nutrient-free food that is so nutrient-free that you can be obese and malnourished at the same time. That would be impossible in the past. Never in the history of the human species or any of our ancestors could that have ever happened.
It's the cruelest irony you can think of.
Especially with the context of what it's been for forever, literally until now. This certainly plays out in how we think about feeding ourselves. So I talk to my students quite a bit about the decision-making process they go through when they decide what they're going to put into their mouths, how they're going to feed themselves, and later when they have families, how they're going to feed their loved ones. And whether you want to believe it or not, our go-to today in the modern Western world is to seek out nutrient-free foods. I mean, we are programmed by media, we're programmed by advertising, we're programmed by literally everything that's bombarding us to overcome our natural kind of desire to eat nutrient-dense foods. We are programmed now to eat and seek out nutrient-free foods. We want to eat all day long and not get fat. I mean, that's what we want to do. Mm-hmm. And we value the ability to do this. In fact, we value it so much, and we've been taught this. This isn't innate. We've been taught this by the media, by advertising, that there was a study done several years ago in modern American grocery stores, and they looked at all the packaged food inside of the grocery stores, and they looked at the labeling and what it was advertising. And I forget the exact number, but something like 80% of the packaged food advertised, boasted about what it didn't have in it. Gluten-free, sugar-free, calorie-free, whatever free, fat-free, whatever. And now some of these things we probably shouldn't have in our bodies. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm referring to is the paradigm. What are we thinking about? What gets us excited? And when we shop, what gets us excited? What makes it so that we grab that thing and stick it into our shopping cart? And we're seeking out nutrient-free foods. So I know it's hard to imagine that and I believe this though, one of the ways to address the modern obesity epidemic is to, believe it or not, shift that paradigm back and seek out nutrient-dense foods. And this goes against everything the modern diet world is telling us. We should be eating salads without salad dressing. We should do X, Y, and Z. And absolutely not. We should be drinking whole milk. We should be eating high quality animal fats. We should be doing everything that we can to suck as much nutrition out of every bite of food that we put into our mouths as possible. We should be fermenting. We should be soaking. We should be grinding. We should be cooking. We should be doing all of those things. And believe it or not, if we do that right, we will regain the health that we've lost over the past, however many years.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of people in these ancestral living type of diets, whatever you want to call them, that are doing just that and regaining their health and freeing themselves of the chronic diseases and not getting sick. And it's so obvious.
It is, but it's so against everything that the modern nutritional world is telling us, the modern medical world is telling us. I got into a huge, I don't want to use the word debate. It was actually an all-out argument with a pediatrician a couple of years ago when he found out that I was raising my kids on raw milk. And it wasn't because of the rawness of the milk. It was because the milk wasn't skim milk. Mm-hmm. And I said, no, you don't understand. Like, this is whole milk. I mean, this is why would we play with it? Why would we take some of the best nutrition that it delivers out of it and then feed it to my kids? Said, yeah, but the obesity epidemic, you have no idea how many kids I had. This is him talking. I have no many kids I have in my care that are obese and they need to cut their fat intake. I said, well, it's not about the fat intake, first of all, but it's about many other things. But what are you saying? He said, I force them and I tell their parents that they should only be drinking skim milk, 1% milk if they're indulgent, but skim milk. It's ridiculous.
Out of this world. I can't believe doctors still think this way.
Well, not all of them, thankfully, but many, many do. And that's where, one of the craziest things to me is that we hire people to tell us how to eat. I mean, that's how disconnected we are from our food. We hire people to tell us how to eat. Yeah. And it's actually illegal in some parts of the world to give dietary advice to another human, unless you're a registered dietitian, a nutritionist, or a doctor. Yeah. It's one of the most human things that we do is feed one another and nourish one another. And
that's so funny. And we hire people, we want to eat so much that we hire people to tell us how to run on a treadmill or lift weights so that we don't get fat.
Absolutely.
Or try to reverse it. Yeah.
And I know I'm not telling you or probably anybody that's going to be listening to this anything they don't already know. But to look at this from a really wide lens, a lens that is 3.5 million years wide, I think really just adds more power to all the things that many of us already believe.
Yeah. And we should go back a little before we get into the modern foods. I still want to get into a few details. Like, vegan arguments, they're talking about that we evolved from chimps and we should be still eating like chimps. And their arguments are so funny. And they're like, oh, well, these apes are so big and strong and look at all the vegetable matter they eat. And so you did definitely talk about how we moved away from that, but just talk about our digestive tracts. I mean, we used to have rumen-like stomachs, right, that digested all this plant matter, and they were large stomachs and long digestive systems, and that evolved and changed into what we have today, which is not meant to ferment plant matter.
Yeah, sure. So there's many parts of this, and I'll highlight a few. One of the most significant things that happened to our digestive tract happened somewhere between 5 to 7 million years ago. And it happened in conjunction with us becoming completely bipedal. So when we stood upright, from that moment forward, spent the majority of our time standing upright on two legs, and our preferred form of locomotion was on two legs. Now, we've all seen videos and YouTube videos or clips of other primates that can walk on two legs. But that's something completely different. Those are for short periods of time. I mean, we even like grab our dogs and pretend to dance in the living room with them and say, oh, they're on two legs, but that's like for 30 seconds. Yeah. So the way that we get around on two legs, not just being on two legs, but the way that our spinal cord is shaped that allow us to independently move our hips and our shoulders from one another so that we don't look like T-Rex walking down the street, that is unique. And when that happened, all of our insides had to fit inside of our pelvic girdle. I mean, we have a very small pelvic girdle. In fact, it's so small that it's very dangerous for human women to give birth. It's painful and dangerous. It's one of the things we gave up when we became completely bipedal. So our guts shrank when we stood upright to be the size of 60% of what a similar sized primate would have. That's almost in half. Our guts shrank almost in half. So as you know, the size of our stomachs have a lot to do with how much we can break down our food, and the size of our small intestines and the amount of time that food stays in our small intestines has a direct impact on the ability to absorb nutrients from that food. So it really was a huge trade-off. And nobody really even knows completely why we began to be completely bipedal. And some people think we have all these arguments like, oh, we stood upright so we could see over the African savanna grasses, see predators or whatever. But we don't really know because it was a huge trade-off. We gave up our ability to get nutrition to stand upright, and we made it really difficult to do the most important thing that any species on the planet can do, and that's successfully reproduce and produce viable offspring. We did that. So our digestive tracts shrunk. Now, yes, can you point to other animals and say, hey, they're massive animals? Well, we already did that with a cow, right? I mean, we talked about it. Now, a cow chews literally all day long. Now, if humans were going to sit and physically chew all day long, maybe we could make the argument that we could feed ourselves without all the technologies that we have. Maybe. But when it's not just body size, it's also brain size in comparison to that body size. So our brains make up 2% of our body, but require 20% of the nutrition that we take in to fuel. So literally every fifth meal that we eat is eaten solely to power our brain. Mm-hmm. Now, if you look at a gorilla, huge, massive beast, their heads are huge. But if you took a look at their skulls, if you peeled away the skin, you'd see massive muscles that not only our jaw muscles extend about 3/4 of the way up the sides of our heads. And if you put your fingers up there and clench your teeth, you can feel where actually those muscles attach to our skulls. Gorillas, those muscles are so huge, and they're huge because they chew all the time and they have to break down massive amounts of vegetable matter. Those muscles are so huge that they not only come up and meet at the top of their skull, but they're so big and thick that that there's a muscle at the top called the sagittal crest that is almost like a fin that runs down the top of their skulls, and it's increased muscle, a bone for muscle attachment. These huge, massive muscles. So underneath this big, huge head is a little tiny brain, and the only reason their heads are that big is because they have massive muscles that are required in order for them to break down and digest the massive amounts of plant material they need to fuel those bodies.
Yeah. So what are the theories of why our brains doubled or tripled in size is due to the meat eating? I don't understand. Do vegans, do they deny that?
Well, I don't know every bit of their arguments. And I will say this, and I don't mean this to be a disclaimer. I mean this to be 100% genuine. I really do value the vegetarian and the vegan perspective. I think if you really broke down all of the arguments that the vegan and the vegetarian community have for why they believe the way that they do, I mean, I don't mean, numbers about size of stomachs and pH and these sorts of things. I mean, their values. Mm-hmm. And you took somebody like us and broke down all the things that we're talking about and the stuff that our values, what we truly believe in, and we had an open and honest conversation, I bet we would agree on much more than we would disagree on. I mean, things like animal cruelty and human diet and health and sustainability and ethics, all of those things are truly at the heart, I believe. At least they are for me, and I'm sure they are for most of our entire community. They're really at the heart of all this. So if we could block out all these little things that we become passionate about and have a real conversation, we'd have much more in common than I think we give each other credit for. So that said, I don't believe meat eating caused our brains to grow. And in fact, I don't think it was just meat. In fact, I think fat had a lot more to do with it. And I think the other majorly important aspects of eating the other parts of the animal were just as, if not more important than the meat. What was important in this conversation. But again, I don't think it caused it. I think it's more accurate to say it supported it. Mm-hmm. What actually was the spark that initiated brain growth is something that we don't have a firm grasp on. And there's all sorts of arguments. There was something pushing us to think outside of the box. It could be increasing forms of communication. It could be, some people suggest that the major food link to all this is that we were supporting larger populations. And one of the most taxing things for our brains to do that requires all sorts of brain power is to create and, more importantly, maintain relationships. And as population sizes grew, it became much more difficult to do this. And, that some people suggest that, well, that's the sort of thing that would have pushed our brains to grow. Complex situations, complex relationships, maintaining these things and all sorts of things, even before Facebook, right? This is important. And some people actually suggest that it could have been something like hallucinogenic drugs that for the first time got us to seriously think outside of the box. And I don't know which one of these to believe. I don't know. There's tons of other ideas.
Yeah, mushrooms. Yeah, eating mushrooms that they would expand the brain or stuff like that.
Exactly. And it is interesting to, and I'm not going to weigh in on that part of this any further, but it is interesting that the earliest forms of artwork, our ancestral expressions outside of our bodies, are almost all geometric sorts of patterns. And although I've actually never taken a drug in my life, but I understand that hallucinogenic drugs often get you to see some of these sort of geographic representations. So it's interesting to think about. But something pushed our brains to grow. And the story that we're really concentrating here on is the diet part. If we didn't have those diets to support that brain growth, it wouldn't have happened. And we did. At the right time, we had the right things happening with our food, and we supported this brain growth. And that's really, the most important part of the story.
Yeah, I guess you can't show the causality, or that doesn't even matter, really. It's just that it happened, and we needed this fuel to make it happen, whatever the mechanism was. And then also there's our ancestors valued fat, right? It seems like we ate a lot of large fatty animals.
Certainly. So we ate a lot. I truly believe we ate fat whenever we had the opportunity to do so. The archaeological record shows that some of the earliest forms of processing of animals included bashing open bones to access the marrow. Now, one of the problems with wild animals when we start talking about fat is that obviously many wild animals, especially in equatorial Africa, have much less fat on them than a lot of our domesticated animals do. Mm-hmm. So fat on their muscles. I'm not talking about marrow. So, and some people use that as, they weren't eating that much fat because these animals were much leaner. Well, no, that's not 100% accurate, because there's still quite a bit of fat internally where the organs are, and there's always fat in the marrow. In fact, an animal will starve to death before it depletes its marrow stores. So there is fat in these animals, and there's certainly fats and all sorts of wonderful lipids in the brains and other internal organs as well. So if you're eating an entire animal, you can get an amazingly nutrient-dense diet. But that's not the way we eat animals today. We certainly eat something like 50% by weight of most of the animals in the grocery store. The rest of it gets thrown away or turned into soap or all sorts of other things.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's why this sort of ancestral living people start talking about eating nose to tail, and they do bone marrow and all that kind of stuff. It's not just some like weird fad. It's totally legit.
Right. I mean, think of how crazy it is that today, most modern Western people who eat animals in any form eat 3 animals. I mean, North America, we eat 3 animals. We eat chickens, we eat pigs, and we eat cows. Very few of us, venture off and do crazy things like eat lamb or a duck. I mean, those are specialty items for us. But we eat 3 animals. But more importantly, or more strangely, we only eat our go-to is certain cuts from each of these animals. I mean, I would imagine most people who are trying to be healthy or are health-minded that do eat meat eat chicken breast. I mean, that's their go-to. And a chicken is one of the strangest things to me. I mean, if anybody ever, and they say it all the time, they say, how do you think you're going to change people's minds with all this crazy business and you're going to get them to eat the X, Y, and Z? That's all very strange. I said, somebody talked us into eating chicken breasts. That's even stranger. If we can do that, do anything. I mean, think about how crazy this is. We've taken a bird and we've domesticated it, forced it into conditions where it doesn't or can't fly, and it produces a brand new type of meat we've never had before in the history of the world: white breast meat. I mean, wild animals don't have white meat. I mean, the reason that it's white is because it doesn't get used. And then somehow somebody convinced us that the healthiest thing that we could eat, if we're going to eat meat, is literally the least nutrient-dense part of that chicken. Some brand new meat. I mean, it's Franken meat. It was the first time that we did this sort of thing. And this nutrient-free breast of meat is the part that we eat. And quite often the rest of it is something we don't even consider food any longer. My mind.
Our ancestors would have thrown it to the dogs. They'd be like, why would I eat this? This has no fat. There's nothing good.
Flavor. I mean, compared to the rest of the chicken, it doesn't even have flavor.
Yeah.
So we eat these certain cuts of meat. We always eat the same cut of beef. We always eat the pork chop. We always eat the chicken breast. And then we come back and then we go somewhere and have discussions about sustainability or ethics of animals. And really, for the first time in 3.5 million years, we're throwing parts of the animal away or not even considering it food. We're targeting in a grocery store. It's hard to see kind of the forest for the trees. We go into the grocery store and we see a package of food. Just like we've seen the box of cereal or the carton of eggs. It's an item, it's a thing, it's whole, right? And we grab it and walk away. But think about doing that same thing in the middle of the woods. You've killed that animal, you've cut a very small portion of it off and walked away and left the rest. That's what we just did in some form, or at least we're supporting that sort of an industry. And that's really the kind of thing that, when I say that we really in many ways have the same sorts of values, really are fighting in many ways for the same thing as many vegetarians and vegans are, or at least part of that community is, I truly believe I truly believe that in order for us to reach our fullest potential as humans, we need to not only incorporate, but focus on eating animals, not the meat, the entire animal. That said, the most respectful thing, the most ethical thing that we can do is be a part of the process. Some of us don't have access to the entire process, but in an ideal world, we all should go hunting at least once. We all should butcher an animal, or at least see it being done at least once. The fact that we can pick up these packaged foods, packaged cuts of meat and call it convenience is really a scary thing. And it's only because of that system that the atrocities that are happening to animals are happening, because we've been distanced from it. They call it visceral insulation. We are no longer a part of that system, so we don't even want to think about it. And I want to put eyeballs and hooves and fur on the plate. I don't mean really on the plate, but every time that we eat, we should be thinking about the animal that gave us that food, the animal that died for that food. It isn't torture. It's life. Things die for us to eat. It's torture when we allow atrocities to happen and turn a blind eye to it. But we should be a part of that process. And at minimum, we should at least know the person that killed the animal or raised the animal or butchered the animal. How many of us can say we actually know the person that's butchered the animal? I mean, that used to be, everybody used to know that.
Mm-hmm.
We don't. I mean, I just came back. I was in Ireland for the year, and literally almost every single village or town in Ireland has at least one butcher. I thought that was amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Like your local, but and everyone knew them, and you go there. Yeah.
So for meat to come into our house, now certainly we are, and we can talk about this in a little while as well. We do have to realize that we are modern people. We are biologically, I believe, we're essentially the same as we've been for 300,000 years. But culturally, we're very, very, very different. We have different expectations of taste and smell and presentation and texture of foods and different access to resources and knowledge and all sorts. And time is a huge strain on us right now as well. So, any food system that's going to be successful and really make a difference has to take both of those things into account. Any food system that as we move forward is going to be truly successful and lasting and make a real difference has to take into account both our biological needs and our cultural needs. So there's nothing that we do that is 100% X, Y, and Z. I have a wife. I have 3 kids. We have 2 careers. We have sports. We have soccer. We have field hockey. We have all sorts of demands on our time. So I do not want to sit here and even suggest that everything that I do is exactly the way that I'm talking about it here. But we try really, really hard. And in terms of meat, the rule is, and certainly it isn't 1,000% this all the time, but more often than not, it is. The meat that comes into our house should have been either killed by one of us, butchered by one of us, or we know the person directly who raised and or butchered those animals. And I would suggest that 95% of the meat that comes into our house falls into one of those categories. And that, to me, is the safest food system. It's not only healthy, but it's safe. The guy that butchers the domestic animals that we buy our meat from knows my kids. He knows them by name. He knows them by face. And to me, I'm thinking, wow, I don't care what sort of label you slap on food. I don't trust it. I don't know anybody that was involved in the process if I pick up a piece of meat from the grocery store. The only person I might know is the person checking me out at the cash register. I don't know anything about the trajectory of that meat. I don't know how it was raised. I don't know who did it. I don't know, what they value. They sure as heck don't know me or my family. But the butcher down the road in Sudlersville, they know me. They've seen my kids. They've talked to them. So when that knife falls on the ground and they have to make that quick, decision whether or not they're going to wash it off before they continue, I'm hoping that the image of my kids are in their head and they wash that knife. That's a responsible and safe food system.
I like that. And it's possible for everyone to do this. I mean, I go to the farmer's market now to try to get a lot of meat and different cuts of the animal too, and the liver and bones and stuff like that.
And the other thing with it, absolutely, because you're going to the place where these animals have been butchered, in some cases where they've been killed as well, and they have that whole animal there. I mean, you can't go to most of the grocery stores and say, I want some marrow bones. They just don't have them. They never made it to the grocery store. All that was done somewhere else. But you can get almost anything that you need to do all the different things to fulfill all the recipes, all the dietary needs. They're there. They're there at your disposal. And sometimes, because you're the only one that wants them, they're free.
Yeah. And no matter what kind of city, I mean, I guess I'm only speaking for Los Angeles, but I mean, this is like a big urban jungle. And if your town doesn't have a butcher, these farmers come in and they find you. There's farmers markets every day of the week somewhere in Los Angeles. And these are the farmers. I've talked to a lot of them and they really care about the process and everything you've talked about. And, they'll spend 15 minutes talking to you about how it all works and how they care for the animals and how it gets down to you. And it's great. And
that your money is going directly into their pockets. I mean, it is. There is that other piece that it's not just us taking. How do our actions help support the people that are doing the right things with food, and cutting out all those middlemen. I think is not only safe and it's connected and all of it, but it also helps them as well. I mean, we live in a very exciting time. right? Because we have all sorts of issues with human diet and health and sustainability. And we could probably talk for 12 hours and not even scratch the surface of all the problems that we have. But I don't think we've had access ever in the history of our species to all of the resources that we have access to today. I mean, we really can, if we approach it the right way, and I mean even information and knowledge, but even the raw materials themselves, if we approach this the right way, this is the perfect time. Because 15 years ago, there were still, then there weren't many butchers around. The number of butchers then was a lot less than now. And you didn't have access to a bunch of farmers markets like you do now. You don't have access to farmers the way that you do now. And now is fantastic. You do. And on top of all this, you have podcasts like yours. You have information all over the internet. There's all sorts of access to resources now that make this the perfect time to make the changes that we need to make.
Yeah, and it's great. And that science is finally catching up, and general consensus hopefully is moving in the right direction and undoing some of the damage of the past sort of 50 years of bad information that led us to a chicken breast as opposed to being a healthy option. And that everyone's trying to do this whole plant-based thing and avoid animals as much as possible. And so, yeah, we're kind of moving in the right direction. But before we talk about the food lab and some other stuff, I want to make sure to hit a few more things.
Sure.
So agriculture, the advent of agriculture, as anthropologists or archaeologists or whatever it's called, whoever looks at these remains, can't you tell the difference? We decreased in size, and you can see in the skeletal remains a difference when we started eating all these grains and moving away from what we used to eat.
Yeah, so advent of agriculture is certainly observable in the archaeological record in a number of different ways. Now, one thing that we do need to keep in mind is that the beginnings of agriculture started at different times in different places in the world, and it wasn't all like overnight. Everybody just started planting huge fields. I mean, it was slow progressions, and it happens quicker in some areas than others, and different crops were adopted in other areas. And in some areas never developed agriculture. Or in fact, there's some that did and then said, forget this isn't for me, and reverted back to hunter-gatherer ways of life. There's examples of that as well. So the one thing about agriculture I can definitively say is that there's no one story. It's very diverse in how it played out around the world. But there are some commonalities. One thing that's very common around the world is that almost all major centers of domestication focused on annual grasses. Obviously, in Southeast Asia, it was things like rice. In places like the Balsas Valley of Mexico, it was maize. In the Fertile Crescent area, it was different forms of wheat and things like this, right? So that's very interesting to note. It does happen within several thousand years of one another. These different centers of domestication popped up. And yes, you can see massive transformations in our skeletons, the skeletal remains from that time period. But even then, the discussion, it's not just a black and white sort of a thing. There are different phases of things. So I do remember my very first class in graduate school. It was a human osteology class, and we were studying human bones. And one of the days we walk into class, and sitting on the table were the skeletal remains from the same place in Pennsylvania. They're Native American remains, and one was hunter-gatherer remains, pre-agriculture, and one was during times of agriculture, right? Remains. And we were brand new into this class, but we hadn't learned much at all yet. And the professor said, "Tell me which one is which." And I couldn't even name all the bones in the body at this point. It was which one is which. And I remember distinctly, and this is many years ago, I remember distinctly one of these, and this isn't just sort of a cliche sort of anecdotal thing. This was real. One of these individuals was robust. The bones were strong. The teeth were strong. There was no evidence of disease. And the other one looked frail. There was littered with cavities and caries, and teeth were missing. And the bones just looked like you could touch them. They turned to powder and riddled with disease. That was it. I mean, that moment when I saw that, I'm thinking, wow, this is super powerful. Now, that said, obviously the strong one was the hunter-gatherer. The other was agriculture. So when we begin to domesticate crops, we create what I believe is the most fragile resource base we've ever created. Now, we think about agriculture in terms of plenty, like, oh, we can take this field, and instead of taking X, Y, and Z wild plants and these wild animals from it, we can create a storehouse full of these grains that we can use all year long, and massive amounts of food, and we can support massive populations. Well, in some ways, when it works, that's true. Now, the food that we're supporting them in terms of calories, but they're not all very healthy. But we can support larger populations if all we want to do is feed them food that has a lot of calories in it. That's absolutely true. But the problem is, when it works, it does that. But there's quite a number of things that can happen and have over the past 15,000 years where the entire system fails and the entire population goes hungry or gets sick or in many cases dies. And here's sort of the way I describe it in class. Let's say, and the numbers I'm going to throw out are completely hypothetical, but they'll help prove the point. Let's say you're in a part of the world as a hunter-gatherer where you need access to 2 square miles worth of resources to feed yourself, right, for the year. So again, this is completely hypothetical, but it's simplified. But then, okay, so there's 20 people in my group. 20 times 2 equals 40. So I need, my group needs access to 40 square miles in this particular environment to feed ourselves for the year. When you start developing agriculture, you start intensifying food production on a smaller piece of land. So instead of 2 square miles, you might only, a little bit of, not very intensive agriculture, but a little bit, you can support yourself on 1 square mile, right? So there's more food coming out of a smaller area. So that 40 square miles now could support 40 people instead of 20. And then when you intensify agriculture and you're focused on, 1 or 2 crops that have a whole bunch of energy, a whole bunch of calories, all of a sudden that 40 square miles can support 500 people. Wow, that's fascinating. And it sounds awesome. And it's usually taught like this is the triumph of human innovation and technology. But there's several things that are problematic here. One is, those 2 square miles that supported you as a hunter-gatherer were filled with probably 300 different types of plants and dozens of different types of animals, and that's what your yearly diet consisted of. But then when you're part of that population of 500 subsisting on that same area, you're literally throwing all that away, and almost all of your food comes from 1 or 2 crops. All of it. We're losing traditional knowledge. You're losing the ability to forage and detoxify foods and to hunt effectively, and your diet is going down the toilet. And that's when agriculture is working. But here's the problematic thing, right? Wild plants grow. We call wild plants weeds because we can't get rid of them. They are completely adapted to the environment that they're living in. We do everything we can to get rid of wild plants. Now, these wild plants have what we call allelochemicals or phytochemicals that they produce that allow them to interact and survive in the outside world. Quite often, these things present as what we call toxins, but what they really are natural insecticides and fungicides and herbicides, and allows them to not be infested with insects and not be overcome with other plants and not, have issues with all sorts of little diseases and other sorts of things. They do it naturally. Now, what they're producing are also in many ways toxic, and we have found over 3.5 million years ways of detoxifying these plants. So these plants are there. They live through almost anything. We harvest large amounts of them, then we detoxify them, then we eat them, and everything's been fine. But when we domesticate them, one of the things we almost always do is get rid of these natural defense mechanisms these plants have. Mm-hmm. So it requires us to start introducing things like insecticides and fungicides and herbicides artificially for these plants to even survive. And what we do is when we start domesticating these plants and they lose their defense mechanisms, they're subject to all sorts of infestations or droughts or blights or all sorts of things. And when you have 500 people living on 40 acres worth of food, the food that's produced on just 40 acres, and something happens to that field, and quite often we're planting literally 1 crop and 1 variety of that crop. Yeah. Something comes through and rips through it like the Irish potato famine, and all of a sudden you have 500 people that in no way could survive from the natural environment around them because we don't have the resource base. So what happens then? We either die or we starve or we get sick or we go and raid the next village and all their stores of food. And this is, in my mind, the story of agriculture. That's what it is. It's a fragile resource base. We've given up diversity in our food. and everything changes at that time. And we focused on feeding large amounts of people with one or two crops that we, in many cases, unless it's processed in amazing ways, and we can do it, but unless it's processed in amazing ways, like if it's wheat, unless it's truly long fermented sourdough bread, or if it's maize, it's been nixtamalized, otherwise we'll never reach our fullest potential as humans.
Yeah. And the alternative is something that's sustainable forever, basically. If you just leave the plot of land with all the natural plants and animals on it, you can reap all the benefits of it. And year after year, it will replenish naturally.
Absolutely. Now, it is true that we have populations now in the world that we've never before seen in the history of the planet, right? So we do have to, and I say all this and it sounds, I mean, if you're buying it all, which I hope you are, it sounds wonderful and romantic and, oh my gosh, we should all be hunter-gatherers again. Awesome. But the problem is, again, we look to the present now and the future for sort of inspiration and say, well, we can't support the current population on just the wild resources that are here. It's impossible. What do we do? So we need to find something brand new. And I don't mean brand new because we haven't invented it yet. Brand new because brand new to me, and this is really what we'll talk later about the Eastern Shore Food Lab, but what my work, the food lab that we're creating at Washington College is really focused on. Our tagline is informed by the past, inspired by the future. The idea that we need to take information from the past. We must. Our bodies are built on our dietary past, our 3.5 million year old dietary past. However, we say the inspired by the future part to recognize that we are very different culturally and in many other ways than we were in the past. We're facing all sorts of other issues than our ancestors were in the past. In an ideal world, if our population size could handle it, we would all be hunter-gatherers in many ways. We can't. But what can we do? Well, this is what we can do. Number one, we need to get connected to our food. We need to reconnect in many ways. And by doing so, I truly believe not only would we reconnect with our health, but we would reconnect with each other. We would reconnect with ourselves, with our community. It would be absolutely fantastic. The benefits of it are amazing. And in order to reconnect the right way, foraging is an amazing way to do it. And you can forage. I have taught foraging classes literally all over the world. And many of those have been in very modern urban environments. You can do it. And I don't mean that I'm not even suggesting that you are able to forage for, everybody in New York City can go out and forage, all of their diet from the cracks in the sidewalks. That's not what I'm suggesting. Mm-hmm. What I'm suggesting is get a couple good foraging books, go on a foraging tour. There's people all over the world that are giving them. Go out, see your natural and even created environment through an entirely new lens. And even if you're only including a couple of forage plants in your diet on a somewhat regular, even sporadic basis, you've done something. You've reconnected with the way that we fed ourselves for millions of years. Go hunting. If you can't hunt or you don't have access to it, go to the butcher. Take a butchering class. If nothing else, get a whole chicken from the store, bring it home, and break it down yourself and cook the different parts. I mean, we need to be a part of this process again. And one of the other things that I truly believe is that you should cook and think it's going to sound simple. It's also at the same time going to sound almost impossible. But think about the ramifications, the benefits of doing what I'm about to suggest. Everything that you love to eat, cook it at least once entirely from scratch. I mean, everything from hot dogs to macaroni and cheese. Make it at least once entirely from scratch. Even if you fail completely, you understand a process now that has been hidden from you your entire life. At best, you'll make it from scratch the rest of your life. At worst, every time you walk into the grocery store, you're going to be an informed consumer and shop in a completely different way. You'll know the stuff that everybody's trying to hide from you. You'll know who at least to buy from or to support with your paycheck when you buy the food that somebody else made. That's how, the reconnection part. The other two pieces that I think are really important to really transforming our diets in meaningful and accessible ways and taking into account both the past and the future and certainly the present is understanding our food and our diets in context. Every piece of our diet, everything that we eat has a story. And there's people that have that story to tell. Meet the farmers, meet the butchers, go foraging yourself, and then tell your family about the things. Make it from scratch and tell your family about the story of how that food was produced. Understand how these different food traditions around the world developed and why they developed. Why are the best and most nutritious tortillas made from corn that's been nixtamalized with lye? Why? What does it mean? That context is super important. And then finally, the focus needs to be on quality. The food and the technology that we use to process that food has to be focused on increasing nutrient density, increasing nutrient variability, and increasing nutrient availability. Those things, I truly believe that we can forge a path forward that is meaningful, accessible, and relevant to even lives of us modern Western, North Americans by focusing on those three things.
That's awesome. What are the most nutrient-dense foods?
The most nutrient-dense foods are properly processed parts of animals, I believe. So fat, for example, organ meats, blood, brains, those sorts of things are certainly the most nutrient-dense. However, I don't believe that should be, I do wholeheartedly believe that variability in our diets is massively important. So I've spent a lot of time studying and living with indigenous groups around the world. I mean, I lived with the Hadza for a while. I was in Mongolia. We were in Kenya recently. And I truly believe that these people's diets, while they are massively focused on different parts of nutrient-dense parts of animals, there's also variability there as well. The Hadza are amazing hunter-gatherers. And when I was there, one of them took down a genet cat. It was in the middle of the night out of a tree. It was so impressive. They brought this thing down, and the very first thing that they did was they ate every single part of the inside of that animal. I mean, the meat was an afterthought. And part of the reason the meat was an afterthought, I don't want to just paint this picture of people with blood hanging off their faces and, dripping down their faces. And that's the end of the story. Part of the reason that people can wait on the meat is because the meat is much more easily stored, right? The organ meats go bad much more quickly. So the couple guys that brought this genet cat back were very much concerned with making sure the other people that were sleeping had access to this animal the next day. They just knew that it was super hot, that the organ meats weren't going to last. So we ate all the organ meats, everything out of the inside, and then the rest of the animal was consumed the next day. But that said, and they celebrated it. They were so excited to have an animal. But they gathered all the time. I mean, the cool thing about being with a real hunter-gatherer group is that they didn't go hunting. They didn't go foraging. They hunted and gathered all the time. They were always hunting and gathering. And in the short time that I was with them, we must have eaten, I bet you, 50 different plants.
Wow.
That was one area, one season, a short period of time, a whole diversity of different plants. But they did. There were things that they cooked in certain ways and they detoxified in certain ways. I mean, their focus was always on this nutrient density. So I think we eat too much meat, but I don't think we eat enough animal. So we should adopt a nose to tail approach it's the only ethical and nutritious way to approach animals in my mind is a true nose to tail approach.
Yeah.
One of the things that we're going to adopt at the food lab is, and I don't know the exact mechanism yet, but some sort of a way to track the different animal parts that people are eating when they come in. I mean, the food lab is focused on teaching and research and all sorts of wonderful experimentation with food, but there's also going to be a dining element to it as well. So when people come in to eat, I don't know exactly how to make this happen, but I'm dedicated to finding a way to make sure that we can keep track of the different parts of the animals that people eat and some sort of adopt some sort of a virtual nose to tail approach where people are rewarded or maybe even forced to eat their way through all the different parts of an animal before they can get back to that pork chop again. It'd be fantastic.
Yeah. Wait, so I want to know more about how hunter-gatherers lived, which is these modern hunter-gatherers. It's a really good indication of how our ancestors lived because there's a lot of misconceptions around our ancestors and that they lived these like sort of brutal lives or they're always starving or they died at 32 or 35. And it just sounded like you painted the opposite picture.
Well, I'll do my best to paint a more accurate picture. And certainly, I am an archaeologist. I've been trained some as a cultural anthropologist, but I'm not even suggesting that I am the person to tell this story.
Yeah.
But I'll do my best from my own experiences, right? The hunter-gatherers that I live with, and certainly the danger always in making statements like this is that we're overlooking to even have a short conversation like this, a whole lot of diversity, right? And different situations. But in my experiences, the people that I've been with, you look at their bodies, and while they don't look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, they look like something Michelangelo would want to represent in some way. I mean, chiseled, but at the same, not chiseled in a hungry way, chiseled in a healthy way, and white teeth, broad faces, white eyes, smiles, and the way it just running through the woods or the jungle, almost like they were prancing. I mean, magical. And the way that they lived was something. Now, I grew up somewhat romanticizing hunter-gatherer sorts of sort of living, and I suppose I still do in some way. So I don't want to paint a picture that's all cheery. I mean, hunter-gatherer life is in many ways still brutal. Some of it's a product of modern times, but some of it just is by default. And there's all sorts of things that we can say about hunter-gatherer life that many of us would revolt at. But in general, these people looked healthy. Now, I say that because hunter-gatherer life now was probably in many ways more difficult than hunter-gatherer life in the past. And the reason is because, and it's not a one-to-one correlation. There's certainly a lot of difference, and there's certainly a lot of modern influences in almost every hunter-gatherer population in the world today. Certainly there's not many of them left, and those that have certainly been influenced to some degree. In fact, the group I was staying with, there was one guy who was the chief's son, the Hadza, that had a cell phone. He had a cell phone. He used WhatsApp, and he didn't have so much of an issue getting a signal. He could go to certain spots and get a signal. The issue was charging the phone. So the only food that this particular group brought in from the outside was a limited amount of maize to make a certain dish that they make. Other than that, everything that they ate was gathered or hunted by them. So every 2 months, somebody would go somewhere and pick up some of this maize. And when they went, they took his phone and charged it. So you can imagine, I was on WhatsApp with this guy for a while. When he gets his phone charged, it's literally 2 days of message after message after message after message, then nothing for 2 months. And then it would happen again. So there are influences, but one of the most detrimental influences of some of these groups is that they have been pushed to the margins of any sort of environment that can support them. So their life is rough. Their life is rougher than it was in some ways, at least as resources are concerned, than it was in the past, because modern farming, modern communities have come in, and they've obviously taken, these more powerful groups, because they had armies or they had police or they had the government behind them, have forced the hunter-gatherer groups literally to the margins and have taken over the best land for themselves to grow crops or to put in communities or whatever, or put in cities or whatever they were doing. So they have less access to resources from the natural world than they probably ever have before. And even with that, and not to romanticize it, the way that they fed themselves is something that I wish I could do on a regular basis. Even I was recently in Kenya, and we were with the Samburu warriors, and the Samburu warriors are nomadic pastoralists. So they follow their during the dry season. They literally, there's so little for their animals to eat. They just follow their herds of animals around, and the men will actually leave for sometimes 6 months at a time, following their herds of cows or whatever it is that they're following at the time, and they'll leave with literally a spear and a knife and walk off.
Wow.
And what they eat every single day, twice a day, is a combination: half milk, half raw whole milk that came directly from the cow, and half blood that they've let or taken out of the cow's neck. And they mix it together and drink it in the morning, and they drink it at night. That's what they eat. And they eat it every day, and they eat it for almost half the year.
Whoa.
And these people are chiseled, happy, broad faces, white teeth, smiling, white eyes. I mean, you wouldn't believe how amazing their bodies are on that diet. And I had it, and I got to tell you, we went there just to meet them, experience this, be a part of the process, and try it. And I have to tell you, it actually was delicious.
Really?
And it tasted like a salty chocolate irony milkshake. It was thick, but not in a disgusting way.
Mm-hmm.
It was probably the strangest thing was how warm it was. I mean, it's obviously body temperature, but the other surprising thing was how satiating it was. I mean, this was full of nutrition. And I use that example when I talk to people. We can have a conversation. It's easy to enter into a conversation about food and diet and sustainability with someone, but it's really difficult to engage in a real meaningful conversation about these things. And in order to do it, you have to say in the beginning, I'm throwing everything on the table. There's nothing taboo.
Mm-hmm.
Let's really talk about how humans have fed themselves forever. And the answer isn't necessarily just in going to the health food store or the farmer's market and eating a couple of organic vegetables. It's really transforming the way that we eat, but not in a new way, in an old way. And a conversation about real diet and health and sustainability must include raw milk, blood, organs, fermentation, soaking, grinding, nixtamalizing, insects. If we're talking about children, it must include something like pre-mastication, which means parents chewing the food and then giving it to their kids and imparting all sorts of wonderful beneficial bacteria and enzymes into their bodies while doing it. This is the kind of conversation that we need to have. And I went to a place where the men subsist for half the year on blood and raw milk and are some of the healthiest people I've ever been around in my life.
That's so
We're
interesting.
going to have a conversation about diet, health, and sustainability. It has to have that story in it.
I want it in the movie. That's so interesting. And how long did you do it for? A couple days?
No, I got to be completely honest. We literally just
Tried it.
Just tried it. I wanted to see. I was very interested in doing two things. So this past year, I was on sabbatical. And I was writing a book, which is currently at the publishers right now. So we're hoping in 5 months it'll be out.
Does it have a title yet?
Not yet. So I don't want to say anything about it yet. But you can look on my website, and I promise I'll keep people updated.
Cool.
But I'm very excited about it. I've poured everything I have into this book, and I think it does a very good job. I hope it does a very good job of laying out our dietary past, looking at those lessons, understanding what options are really out there by looking at modern indigenous groups and traditional groups, and even some of the top Michelin star chefs around the world, and looking at what they're doing. And then the second half of the book just focuses on ways of incorporating all of these lessons into our modern Western lives, everything from approaches to techniques to recipes. So I'm very, very, very excited about it. But this past year, in addition to writing that book, I was engaged in a bunch of research and professional development, working with indigenous groups around the world and working with some of these Michelin star chefs. And I was simultaneously focused on making sure I gave those same experiences to my family for a couple of reasons. One is I wanted them to experience it, but I also wanted to try to see what they were experiencing through their eyes, right? So, I mean, it's one thing to tell this story. I'm a 45-year-old white American male, and there may be an audience that might listen to what I have to say, but it's also very important that an audience that there's different audiences that might do better hearing about the experience from my 14-year-old daughter, or my 12-year-old son, or my 10-year-old daughter, or my 40-year-old wife. What they experience the same thing, but they experience it in different ways and through different eyes. So we're working right now to try to find ways that they can use their voice to tell some of these stories as well. But we're there, and I wanted to make sure everywhere that we were able to see and experience and document the technologies that the food-related technologies, people in which they were engaged, and also try, actually taste and see what these things actually tasted like, and what did it feel like to experience, this meal with them in this environment. And that's what the last year was. It was a magical year.
Wow. Did you eat brain?
I have eaten brain. We didn't eat. We weren't anywhere that we did have brain. I don't believe. Maybe at a restaurant, but not. I have. I've had yak brain in Siberia. Well, Mongolia. Well, I've had lots of different kinds of brains, but out in the wild, only a couple different types.
What about the show? So I watched some of the show.
What did you watch?
The Great Human Race. It's called, for anyone listening, and I watched the Cave episode.
Yeah, Cave. I love that episode. So several years ago, National Geographic came up with a brilliant idea. They wanted to capitalize on or make use of the survival TV genre that has got many people very excited, and use it as a platform to tell a story, a real story, the story of our ancestral past. And they contacted me several years ago, and a woman named Kat Bigney, who's a survival instructor from the Boulder Outdoor Survival School, and they paired us up, and they said, "This is what we want. We want to do a 10-part series, a reality show, but a reality show that's steeped in archaeology and prehistory and primitive technology and all of the sorts of messages and information that people typically don't have access to unless they read the right books or are enrolled in the right college courses," right? So they wanted to use that platform of survival TV to tell this very important story. And what they did was that there's going to be 10 episodes, and each episode is going to take place at it's going to represent a different time period in our ancestral past where a specific monumental technology or technologies were created that allowed us to do something. And we'd start at 2.5 million years ago in Tanzania and go all the way through our past, making these 10 stops, ending at 4,000 years ago in Oregon. And the idea was that I was going to recreate these technologies, and that we were going to use only those technologies to live or survive for a period of about 8 days each time in each of these places where that technology had appeared in the past. So we started 2.5 million years ago in Tanzania with an Oldowan, really basic stone tool technology. Fire wasn't even invented yet. And then we went through and went to Uganda and Ethiopia and Oman and Turkey and Georgia and Mongolia, all the way through, and ended up in Oregon. And it was a really important life-altering experience on so many different levels. And one of the things that I really value, and it was a difficult experience in many ways. I learned a lot about myself, but Kat and I are the only two people on the planet that actually lived as close as we could all of the major milestone time periods in our evolutionary past. And it was only for a few days. It was almost always 8 days at a time, but it was just long enough to start to feel what it might have felt like. Right. And again, it wasn't 100%, and it wasn't a 1-to-1 correlation, but it was, as an archaeologist and as a professor, to actually have the opportunity to rely on and use the tools that I've been teaching about for a very long time was amazing. How efficient really are they? How do they work? How much food can I actually get? How scared am I because I don't have fire and I'm sleeping out in a baobab tree in the middle of Tanzania? These are the kinds of things that we went through. But for me and this period of my life and the research that I'm doing now, the opportunity to seriously be forced to use these technologies to feed ourselves was amazing. And to see what was it like? What did it taste like? How hungry were you really? And it was, certainly there were all sorts of obstacles, all sorts of things we had to overcome. And it was really groundbreaking in many ways for a reality TV show to even try and do this. But it firmly established in my mind and in my soul that this path forward, this looking into the past to understand how to transform our diets in the present and in the future, is the right way to do it.
I was going to ask what the biggest takeaway was, and it sounds like that was it.
That was certainly it. There were so many things. Everything from I made clothes. I know this isn't about food, but and that's what we're talking about, food. But this is an important one for me. Most of the technologies that I had to reproduce or make, or so that we could use and live with during this series, I've done before at some level. I didn't have to rely on them before, but I've engaged in them and I've reproduced these tools before. But the one thing that I really had very little experience in was clothes, making clothes. And I'd brain tanned before, and I've made leather, and I've made quivers for hunting and these sorts of things. But I haven't never made a full set of clothes before, and worn them and relied upon them to protect me. And one of the things that I told the producers very early on is, if you want me to do this, I have to do it right. I have to be in charge of making sure that I represent the technology properly and all this. And I got to make all my own clothes. Mm-hmm. Like, you got to let me do it, because I haven't done it and I need to make sure that I do. Mm-hmm. And I spent somewhere around 400 or so hours outside of us doing the show. Like we'd have a break every 5 weeks or so. We'd have like a 2-week break, and I came home and all I did was sew clothes. Brain tan deer skins with sinew, and I mean hundreds of hours making clothes. Now I didn't tan all the skins. Actually, an amazing brain tanner named William Smith from Kentucky tanned most of our skins that we used to make the clothes. But I sewed all of my clothes. Not the first 2 episodes. The first 2 episodes were representing time periods where we probably didn't have clothes at all. And we kind of compromised with modern and ancient sort of clothing to show that we weren't representing what people wore at the time, that we're supposed to be naked, but we weren't naked, obviously. Yeah. But from episode 3 forward, everything that I made it all. And not only making it was mind blowing to gain those skills and to understand how the clothing was made, but also wearing them and seeing what they felt like and how they did protect you or didn't protect you and things to look out for and those sorts of things, but also how to maintain these clothes, because sometimes some of these clothes that we were wearing in the past were absolutely the best possible solutions for the environment we were in, but we had to take extra special care of them. Like getting brain tan skin wet is horrible, and all the work that you need to do to get that skin back into the state where you can wear it again. So those sorts of things were kind of ancillary, but mind-blowing and really helpful to me on a professional and a personal level.
That's really cool. So what else did you learn about how our ancestors likely lived? Going back to, I asked, what was it like? Yes, it was kind of brutal at times, but you told me about the modern hunter-gatherers, that they were strong and healthy and vibrant. And what about our more ancient ancestors? What did they likely live like?
That's a really good question. So again, I need to do the disclaimer for there's a ton of diversity over 3.5 million years, right? But and different geographic reasons. Certainly, people in the Arctic were battling different sorts of things than people in, say, Tanzania. But this is my take on it, and this is coming from my understanding of the archaeological record, my understanding of other people's interpretations of the past, my work with the show, all of that. The way that I feel about it is that we use the word survival way too loosely. And survival isn't the proper term to talk about our ancestors in the past. And I'll give you a couple of examples why. Let me kind of lead up to the main point of this conversation. A few months before, and this is very telling, I promise. A few months before I was contacted about the National Geographic show, my students were actually urging me to go on Naked and Afraid. Mm-hmm. And while I was excited that they thought that I could go on Naked and Afraid and do a very good job, I didn't necessarily want to go on Naked and Afraid for a couple of reasons. Mm-hmm. And however, I do love the show, or aspects of the show. Again, not because of the reasons that it probably has decent ratings, that you've taken a man and woman, never met each other before, and stripped them down naked, but the fact that you've stripped these humans down to nothing and they need to survive. And what does that mean? I was very fascinated by that idea, but I didn't think that I could just turn around and tell the students no, because it'd make me look like I couldn't do it or something, right? So I said, I know what I'll do. I'll go to my wife. And I'll tell my wife that the students are asking me to go on Naked and Afraid, and she's going to definitely not let me do it. So I went to her, and she's seen a couple episodes at this point. And I said, hey, the students are asking me to do this. What do you think? She thought about it for a moment, and she looked up. She goes, it'd be okay. And I said, wait, what? You're supposed to save me from this. Why do you think it'd be okay? You let me go in the middle of nowhere with a naked woman for 28 days or whatever? Mm-hmm. She said, absolutely. Are you kidding me? I've seen that show. If anybody had any amorous thoughts in their head after one day of not eating and getting bitten by bugs and all the other things that are happening to them, it's the last thought on their mind. Mm-hmm. I'm like, oh, you're absolutely right. So, and that was a light bulb moment for me. So then I went to the dean of the college and I said to her, hey, they're definitely not going to let me do this. So I said, hey, what do you think if I went on Naked and Afraid? She's like, what is it? Tell me about it. And I told her. She's like, yeah, we'd be fine with it. I think it'd be fantastic. I'm like, damn. So anyhow, luckily I got contacted by National Geographic and it never became a thing. But the point of the story is my wife's reaction. It was very telling. Now, certainly I don't want to equate Naked and Afraid with our ancestral past, but there is a correlation we can make here, or at least a lesson we can get from it. The most important thing that we can do as a species, if we want to survive and not become extinct, is reproduce and produce viable offspring. That means those offspring can then reproduce as well. If we fail to do that, we'll become extinct. Period. Mm-hmm. People that are surviving probably don't have sex. And if they do, they don't have a lot of it. And even if somebody gets pregnant, the ability to successfully carry that pregnancy to full term, produce a viable baby human, and feed that baby human so they can take care of themselves is almost impossible. If our past was a story about survival, we wouldn't be here to tell the story.
That is.
Our story, our past is a story about subsistence, accomplishment, doing well. Now, I don't want to paint a picture of roses and a romantic picture of these wonderful, wonderful, it's always easy, because it wasn't. It was anything but it certainly wasn't survival. And that's not to say people weren't in survival situations, not to say entire populations didn't die off. But the overall arcing story of our past is a story of doing really, really well. And in fact, doing so well that we got bigger, or doing so well that we got better. That's the story. And that's actually a very important and significant way, I think, to look at the past.
I think that's a great way to explain it. I'd never thought of it that way. And I think it's very indicative of what went on.
Certainly. I mean, one of the things that we as humans gave up when we became bipedal, and we decided, or somebody decided for us, that our brains were going to grow bigger, is difficulty in pregnancy and delivering children, right? So human females have the most difficult time giving birth than any other animal on the planet. And one reason is because of the size and shape of our pelvis. But the other is that they're giving birth to incredibly huge-headed kids. Mm-hmm. But even with that, one of the ways that we've created humans with such big heads and still allow the mothers to live through the pregnancy, which is obviously very important, is to extend the growth that would have normally taken place inside the mother to take place outside the mother after the baby's born. And this period of time, we call it neoteny, is a very dangerous period of time in human infant life. Right? We give birth to useless babies. Mm-hmm. So if you've ever seen another animal born, like a horse or a sheep, baby's born, and you stand there and you wait for it to stand up. And if it doesn't stand up in a certain period of time, you call the vet because something's wrong. We wait like a year for our kids to walk. And what's happened is if we allowed for all the growth that we need to take place till we can produce a baby that is as able as one of these other animals, the head would never fit through the pelvic girdle. It just wouldn't happen. So we give birth to the babies that are very susceptible to all sorts of issues, can't fend for themselves, and that we have to take care of for long periods of time, but definitely within the first several months or year of life. We have to feed and carry around and support heads and do all these sorts of things so it can grow. And a lot of learning and a lot of growth takes place during that first year, and requires amazing nutrition in order for that to happen. And that nutrition obviously comes from the mother through her breast milk, but she has to take in the right nutrients in the right form to produce the right kind of milk to support this baby that can't fend for itself. And the entire thing goes back to needing amazing nutrition during that very, very, very important year. So people that are barely surviving, that even have the ability to produce a living infant, very rarely have the opportunity to support that baby during these very crucial times in its early growth.
Yeah, so that indicates that they were thriving and they had ample foods, and that we've seen this in modern times too. I love the Weston A. Price stuff where he traveled around, kind of like you did, and saw how these people lived, and they had a highly prized diet of animal foods, a lot of nutrient-dense plant foods as well, to feed these babies in this time. And it was cool to me that it was across all these cultures, that it was always the same, that they had these rituals and they knew instinctively of what foods to feed the pregnant mothers, or even before they were even married, they would put them on a special diet. Even for 6 months, there was these traditions they had that they knew instinctively to do. But also it shows that they were very self-sufficient and that they were very good at getting enough food from their environment, that they weren't just always in the survival mode. And yeah, it sounds like you're trying to be safe because people think you're biased because you romanticize this type of living. But from all the stuff that I've read and researched, we have sort of the wrong picture of our ancestors. that they very, very likely, and all this stuff you just said, these stories indicate that this must have been true, is that they were thriving and they didn't have to spend, like I've heard estimates of that they only spent 4 hours a day foraging or gathering food or hunting on average, that it wasn't like they were doing this 12 hours a day. Is that true?
Yeah. So again, it depends on the environment that they're in and the technologies they have to extract the resources from their environment. But the average number of hours that a hunter-gatherer spends there's all kinds of estimations, but always the number of hours that hunter-gatherers spend to feed themselves is significantly less than the number of hours that we spend in the modern world to feed ourselves. I mean, it's insanely different. And part of it has to do with the fact that we feed ourselves because we work 70 hours a week and use that paycheck to pay somebody else to do that food, or to get that food and process it for us. But yes, the amount of, it was wonderful when anthropologists started writing about hunter-gatherers and in a way that made us completely transform our view of their lives. It wasn't this brutal, harsh survival. It was, wow, they had more leisure time as hunter-gatherers than we enjoy today.
Mm-hmm.
Unbelievable. And the cool thing is, with those sorts of lifestyles, all sorts of other issues of modern Western life aren't there, right? Things like certain kinds of stress that we deal with today, and lack of sleep, and all these other things that are significantly impacting our health, far and above just food-related things. But they take care of themselves in a situation like that. They don't even present.
Yeah. Everything. I mean, I guess this is obvious, but every problem we have is due to our modern way of living, whether it's the societal or stress or habits even, or the foods. It's all just based on how different it is from how we used to do things, right? And that's what people call like the mismatched diseases, right? All these problems we have is just a mismatch between our ancient genes and how we're supposed to live and how we're living today.
Sure. I 100% agree with that. And here's the question that I always get if I'm speaking or teaching or presenting or this sort of information. Invariably, there's always somebody in the audience that then says, "Okay, well, then what? We can't go back." And it's a great question. It's a great question and a great statement at the same time. We can't go back.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we do? And I've pondered this. I've wrestled with it. I know many of us have for quite a long time. And my answer, at least at this moment, is exactly what I said earlier. My answer is that we need to acknowledge our biological needs and meet them with our food. And we need to acknowledge our cultural needs and also meet them with our food. And in that vein, that's where a lot of my research is directed right now. A lot of my teaching is directed right now. And it's also, in many ways, all of my efforts are directed right now. At the college I mentioned earlier, we're creating this food lab. We're calling it the Eastern Shore Food Lab. And the focus is on just that. How do we meet these biological needs and these cultural needs at the same time? How do we create a food system that is relevant and meaningful and accessible in the world that we live in today? Because I don't care how romantic or how cool stories are about the past, we are not living 300,000 years ago. We're a far cry different than we were 100 years ago. So we can talk about these things all day long, and I love to. But in order to enact real change, we have to do something that acknowledges both worlds, the cultural world and the biological world. So this is why I founded the center. All of our work is focused on this. Much of the work is focused on teaching and education. A lot of it's also going to be focused on the creation of food itself. And what we're doing is we're taking lessons from the past. So we're using the archaeological record and the experimental archaeological record to better understand as much as we can about our dietary past. We are working with food leaders around the world. In some cases, they're top star Michelin chefs like Kevin Thornton from Ireland. I've worked with him very, very closely. He's amazing and inspiring at the same time. We're working with food producers to understand much more about the good things that are happening in the modern food industry. We will be launching a series of workshops and classes and demonstrations and lectures that are focused on not only informing people, but connecting people to their food and how it's made. And as I said earlier, we're going to be producing all sorts of food that are completely in line with our mission. I'm super excited about this. It's taking all of my time. I can't wait for us to launch next month.
That's so awesome. And yeah, that's right in line with everything I'm doing, I guess. I'd love to support you. And I guess you have a website, ancestralinsight.com. Do you also have a food lab website?
Right. So there's several places that you could follow along with our progress and what we're doing. My personal website is ancestralinsight.com. There is a website that we have that followed along all the work and documented the work that I did last year. And that is the project was the Food Evolutions Project. And the website is foodevolutions.org. There's an S on the end. And then information specific to the Food Lab you can find it by going through Washington College website, which is washcoll.edu. So WASHCOLL.edu. And then /ESFL for Eastern Shore Food Lab. On social media, you can follow the work that I'm doing at Dr. Bill Schindler, and the Food Lab is on there as well to follow along things that are specific to the Food Lab at ESFL.
That's great. I'm excited for all of this stuff. And I keep talking about this thing I'm trying to do called the Sapien Movement, which sounds exactly what you're trying to do. To me, Sapien just means what humans are supposed to be doing, right? Whether it's eating or living or cooking or anything like that.
You know, it's so important what you're doing as well, because that's the key. We isolate so many things. We silo so much of our lives now. It's how we're taught. It's how we operate. And you can't silo this. It's not about food. Mm-hmm. It's about food and living and connecting and interacting. And it's about not only just what we put into our mouths, but what is the context within which we're eating? Who are we eating it with? How are we eating it? Are we getting enough sleep? Or, are we getting enough exercise? What is our work life like? All of those things. The only way that we're going to make real change is to transform and pay attention to all of it. It's not just one thing. So what you're doing sounds fantastic.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And yeah, and it can be done in a modern way. Obviously, we're not going to go back, like you said, but you can do all those things and live, have a normal job and live a normal life and be a normal person in society. It's not even much more expensive, if at all. I mean, we can't get into a whole nother topic here, but yes, there's ways to keep our ancestral ways of living in mind today and live a normal life. So
that's a perfect takeaway. You're absolutely right.
All right. Well, check out his websites and all the stuff he's doing. Thank you so much, Dr. Bill. And I will try to fly out actually to Maryland and get you in the film. I think it would be perfect to see all this and go into your lab and look at some remains. And I think it would be amazing. So I'm going to make it happen.
Well, I hope you can. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I'll talk to you later. So there it is. I'm still working to get over to the East Coast and film with Professor Schindler for Food Lies. You can pre-order the film on Indiegogo and check out the other perks we're offering there, like the movie poster and shirts. Leave us a review on the Apple Podcast app by just tapping the 5-star icon. You can choose how many. Follow us on social media, share with a friend, watch some YouTube clips of the experts featured in the film. Eat nose to tail, don't worry, be happy, and see you next week with another great guest.